Okay, and that about does it. So Ryan, take it away.
Thank you, Kitty. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being on this morning. As Kitty said, I am the research analyst here, trivia guru. But today we're going to talk about a story that happened right here in Buffalo in the Elmwood Village. So picture it, Sicily, 1903. No, just kidding. Like I said, we're doing this in Buffalo. So we're in Buffalo. The year's 1903. As many of you know, Buffalo is home to more millionaires per capita than any city in the United States at this point in time. And while Delaware Avenue within the city of Buffalo was designated as Millionaires Row, it was the Elmwood Village that was more known as the playground for the younger married set. So in the late 1800s and 1900s, Buffalo's booming with industry. It's happening place. There's many influential figures, not only locally, but regionally, nationally. We're also a few years removed from the Pan American Exposition and the assassination of President McKinley, which happened during that. However, newspapers at this time would produce stories of the younger elites in the area and the scenes that were playing out within the Elmwood Village. Newspapers would report that well-to-do professionals of the district were fast-living, sex-ridden aristocrats who engaged in strange orgies and drank champagne treated with aphrodisiacs during said orgies. So during this time, there are some people you've probably heard of that are super influential. You have Roswell Park, William Carey, who invented the air conditioner. We have Darwin Martin, John J. Albright, George Foreman, not the boxer and grill maker, John Larkin, and also John Milburn. The one thing that you may not know about John Milburn is his house was the house they took President McKinley to after he was shot, where they tried to give life-saving measures to save the president at that time. So that's why John Milburn made my list. So there are four main characters of our story today. Two couples. The first couple are the Burdicks, Edwin, who's 40, and Alice, who's 42. And we also have the Pennells, Arthur and Carrie, who are both 38 years old. So the Burdick's early life. So Alice and Edwin married in 1885. Edwin came from humble beginnings and worked very hard after moving to Western New York to establish himself. Edwin started off as a stenographer and worked his way up the ladder at the Buffalo Envelope Company. As he worked his way up the ladder at the Buffalo Envelope Company, Edwin also started his own business called E.L. Burdick and Company. Alice and Edwin would have three children after getting married, all girls, Marion, Carol, and Alice. Marion was 15 at the time of our story. Carol was 13, and Alice was 9. The family lived at 101 Ashland in the Elmwood Village, which is pictured at the time on our slide to the right here. That's what the house looked like. And Mrs. Maria Hall, Alice's mother, moved into the residence after the passing of her husband in 1897. So live-in grandma. The Pennells. So Arthur's upbringing was maybe, how should we say, a little easier than Edwin's. Arthur's father was a wealthy sea captain who was able to afford to send Arthur to Yale, where he went on to become a lawyer. Arthur and Carrie married, but they did not have any children of their own, and they lived at 208 Cleveland Avenue in the Elmwood Village, which is pictured here to the right in this nice mint green color. So with Arthur and Edwin both being well off and engaging in the community of the Elmwood Village, their friendship began. Edwin and Arthur were avid golfers, so they would frequently play golf together. Ed even became the president of their local golf club called the Red Jacket Club. The Burdicks and Pennells, the wives even became very great good friends, Alice and Carrie, and they would frequently go on vacations together. They became such good friends that Arthur was named the godfather of Edwin's children, the three girls. And the Burdicks and Pennells were close with some other well-off families, namely the Paynes and the Warrens, and we'll talk about them later. So, as you know, back in the early 1900s, it was a few years before the 24-hour news cycle we are subject to now. So the main way to get your news was either radio or the newspaper. So the Burdicks were often in the public eye as local papers would write about them and what social events they were attending, awards or charitable donations or things that they were doing. Also being president of the Elmwood Dance Club, affiliated with a church within the Elmwood Village. I have not found what church it is, but I continue to look. Edwin was really looked as a pillar of the community. And many blue collar folk around Buffalo held Edwin in very high regard due to the fact that he was a self-made success story. Um, he came and worked his way up the ladder and didn't seem to have the pretentiousness of some of the other aristocrats in the area. January 1st, 1901, Happy New Year, or so we thought. So on New Year's Day in 1901, Edwin was informed that Arthur and Alice were having an affair by Arthur's wife, Carrie Pennell. Carrie went to Edwin and hoped that Edwin would be able to break off the relationship and that both couples could move forward with their own relationships but still be friends moving forward. Um, After getting this news, Edwin confronted Alice about the affair, and she never really denied anything and doesn't show any signs of saying that these allegations were untrue. She kind of just shrugs it off and goes, meh, believe what you want to believe. So, after getting upset in their confrontation, Edwin starts storming throughout the house looking for things. And later that day, Edwin found that Alice had a box of love letters from Arthur that were hidden away. And he goes on and gives these letters to Mrs. Hall. Now, I'm not saying that I would have given those letters to my mother-in-law, but he decided to give them to her for safekeeping. So after the confrontation earlier in the day, this leads to another confrontation later that evening between Alice and Edwin leaves the house fuming. Edwin checks into a hotel after leaving that evening, decides to stay there for a few days to let his emotions settle, let the situation cool off, cooler and clearer heads prevail. But some letters that have survived from this time period, um, from Edwin to his associates at the E.L. Burdick Company and the Buffalo Envelope Company, show that he was deeply hurt by this betrayal of not only his wife, but the person who he believed to be his best friend, in Arthur. So after a few days and cooling off, Alice gets in touch with Arthur, or gets in touch with Edwin to let him know that the affair with Arthur has ceased and that he can come home so they can start mending their relationship. So after returning home, Edwin and Alice try to make their relationship work and mend the damage done by the affair. Um, so despite Alice assuring correspondence with Arthur had ceased, Edwin just has this gut feeling that it had not. Um, Edwin, with talking to associates around town and some friends in the circles and uh, someone we will talk about later who happened to be quite the social butterfly, discovered that Alice had opened a secret P.O. box and went to investigate. And some of you who may have a P.O. box or a lockbox at a bank may know that usually you're able to assign a specific person to gain access to that if you are not there. So Arthur, working at the envelope company, knows a little bit about the mail and how it works. So he poses as Alice's brother, saying she's under the weather and he's just coming to get some mail for her or to check the P.O. box for some mail. He gains access to this P.O. box and he finds more letters from Arthur inside. Now, he worked at the Buffalo Envelope Company and he was a pretty smart guy. So Edwin goes in and secretly opens the letters using steam to read them prior to Alice. So he's getting the juicy details of these love letters between the two of them after correspondence had ceased. But then before he would leave to make sure Alice didn't know that he knew what was going on, he'd reseal these letters and put them back as if they were never disturbed. So I said, like, it's a pretty smart guy, Mr. Edmund Birdie. So after reading the secret love letters between Alice and Arthur, um, Edwin is fed up and requests that Alice leaves the residence. So Alice is forced to leave. So in May and June of 1901, Alice goes and puts herself up in a hotel in Atlantic City. Meanwhile, her mother, Mrs. Hall, stays behind to help Edwin care for their girls. Now, just making sure. Beginning of 1901, we have the allegations come untrue. 5, 6 months later, things cool off. They start to mend the relationship. He discovers these letters late April, early May, and um, and from there she goes to Atlantic City. So Edwin at this point in time, first strike was New Year's Day. Second strike, we're finding these letters. Edwin is continued to be hurt by the betrayal, once again, not only of his wife, but his best friend, and starts to lay the threat out of divorcing Alice. Now, Alice is a stay-at-home mother. She does not work. Edwin is the main breadwinner, so losing out on this upcoming well-off man in the community would be quite detrimental to her lifestyle. But Alice, who's also very cunning, starts using the situation and the affections of Arthur to chip away at Edwin after the threat of divorce. Um, in correspondence, Alice starts stating how Arthur wants to come see her, um, but in order to maintain and repair the relationship with Edwin, she's making sure that Arthur doesn't come see her because she really feels in her heart of hearts that Edwin and her can work out their relationship as long as he doesn't divorce her. So while they're corresponding between May and June of 1901, Edwin proposes to let Alice return home under one condition. Edwin proposes that if Arthur is to leave the city of Buffalo, that she can return home. And if Arthur was to love Alice so much and that he would do anything for her, that he would be inclined to oblige this request of Alice to Arthur. But unfortunately, Arthur and Alice are not married for them. And Alice pretty much goes to Edwin and says, what you're asking me to ask Arthur is impossible. I can't make him leave the city. He would have to pack up his practice, his wife, his whole home, and that just seems to be outlandish. And after breaking down the situation, kind of chipping away at him still, Edwin finally agrees to allow Alice to return home as long as she breaks all ties with Arthur for good. But as we know, tigers cannot change their stripes. So upon her return home in July of 1901, Alice continues to write letters to Arthur, and their affair and communications continue. As I said earlier, as these communications continue, Alice never realizes that Edwin has been keeping tabs on her affair with Arthur the whole time, and Edwin finds out that this affair started in 1898, conveniently 1 year after Mrs. Hall moved into the residence, and there was an extra set of hands and eyes to keep track of the children. Not to say that the maids and butlers and people they had within the home couldn't do that too, but it's better to have family watch the children. So, with learning about this affair starting in 1898, Edwin hires a private investigator to start gathering evidence, as Alice never kept her word of cutting ties off with Arthur, and Edwin really wants to get as much evidence as he can for the divorce proceedings. So it's during this time, Arthur is very cautious. Um, Even though he never knew that Edwin was reading these letters prior to Alice opening them, he would started leaving cryptic messages inside of the letters. Um, Even though the affair does continue, Alice starts to fear that Edwin will leave her, but in the same breath that Arthur will not leave his wife, Carrie, even if she was to be divorced from Edmund. So this love triangle starts to unfold in a game of hot potato as well, with to see who will be left holding the loneliness bag. So Alice starts to have these fears of both being divorced and out in the cold, quote unquote, and being divorced and out in the cold with no lover. So, as I said, Arthur starts leaving these cryptic messages within these letters, and over time, Edwin starts to piece together what these different sayings and cryptic messages mean. And Edwin finds out from piecing it all together that there is a date set up between Alice and Arthur, and Edwin plans to catch them in the act. So, after putting together when they're going to be together next, and figuring out that um, they're going to be together, Edwin shows up at the apartment that he knew Arthur rented, knowing Alice was there. So as he gets there, he knocks on the door. Arthur comes to the hallway. Um, Edwin confronts him, stating, "I know my wife is in there." He starts to force his way in to go find her. During this time that Arthur stops him, a short scuffle unfolds in the hallway of the apartment between the door and the hallway. After about 2 or 3 minutes of this scuffle, um, Arthur finally lets Edwin into the apartment. During this time, though, Alice has time to gather her belongings, get herself together, and escape down a balcony on the backside of the apartment building. So, after going through the house, Edwin's looking in rooms and under beds and different areas of his apartment. He realizes that Alice is not there, leaves, and returns home. As he's heading home later that day, Alice returns home, acting like nothing happens. I was out shopping and perusing some things, but Edwin knew this was based on a lie, because he showed up at the apartment where he said he was going to be. Um, Arthur was very defensive and confrontational about him asking if his wife was there, stopping him from entering the apartment, which was a little weird. And if she wasn't there, why wouldn't you just let me check? So, with this being the last straw, Edwin states that Alice must leave the next morning, and she's given the night to pack up her necessary things, and she has to be out before sunrise. Bye bye, Birdie. So after being kicked out in December of 1902, so here's our timeline, just to keep up. 1901, we figure out that the relationship surfaces by Carrie telling Edwin. In late April, early May, Edwin's had enough of the correspondence continuing. Alice is kicked out and she goes to Atlantic City for 2 months. She comes back home in July of 1901. Now, things start to get better through the end of that year, but Edwin starts to discover that the secret P.O. box happens, these letters are happening, the correspondence keeps going. So for another year after that, this happens. So Alice is kicked out in December of 1902. Happy holidays. And Alice spends a few days with Arthur up in the illustrious Niagara Falls. Um, then from there, after spending a few days with Arthur, she goes to Atlantic City where she stays for a little while. And then she goes back to Atlantic City where she was staying before at her first leave of absence. So, over this time, Edwin was really trying to forgive her, let things go, but Alice could not just stop her behavior, and neither could Arthur. So, in early 1903, Edwin files divorce papers, and they're to be finalized on March 5th of 1903. Happy New Year, Alice. So Alice, before he officially files, and after learning that he filed, is pleading for Edwin not to divorce her and to take her back. But at this point in time, Edwin says, 3 strikes and you're out. I've given you ample time and ample opportunities to change your ways, to correct your behavior, and you couldn't do it. So I am proceeding with the divorce. And in his heart of hearts, Edwin knew deep down that Alice was not going to be faithful to him if he did give her another chance at redemption, quote unquote. So good news travels fast in a vacuum. So Carrie Pennell finds out about the divorce filing and writes to Edwin, pleading for him not to divorce Alice. Carrie Pennell in this is also having those fears that if Arthur's having this affair with Alice, if Alice is to become single, what's stopping Arthur from divorcing me and going to be with Alice? So once again, there's this love triangle, rectangle fiasco of now hot potato, who's going to be left the lonely one? So Edwin, feeling sympathetic for Carrie, says, I understand what you're going through. I've been going through the same thing since learning about this, but I can't go on living a lie with someone who doesn't love me, and I'm young enough to move on to find someone who will be faithful to me. So now, a few days later goes by. After the letter's written, Arthur shows up at Edwin's office one day to meet and talk with Edwin. After they're talking, Arthur's laying out all this stuff on the table about how Edwin can't go through with the divorce, that Alice really loves him, that he'll finally take a step back from the relationship and that was wrong with him. And unfortunately, that conversation doesn't go the way Arthur had hoped. So Edwin saying, you're feeding me a bunch of lines and lies. You were my best friend. You were the godfather of my children, and that you continue to betray our trust and friendship, and says that he's going through with the divorce and dismisses his former best friend. And at this point in time, Arthur becomes so enraged that he, in turn, in the office that day, threatens, since he's going through with the divorce, to kill Edwin. He threatens to kill Alice, and he threatens to kill himself if these things go public and the divorce is finalized. So Arthur leaves. A couple of days go by, and Edwin goes out and purchases a revolver for quote unquote self-protection. But according to business partners that were interviewed at the time, this was not out of fear of Arthur Pennell. This was just for self-protection. If you ask me, if I was threatened by someone that they were going to kill me, my potential ex-wife, and themselves, that might be cause for a purchase of self-protection, quote unquote. So it's the early 1900s, like I said at the start of the story. Honor and status at this time are huge in society. These well-off aristocrats, barons of industry are looked at as these pillars of the community that are untouchable. So to have these big scandals, especially having these 2 well-off families, quote unquote, fast living sex-ridden aristocrats having these pretty public affairs play out, getting divorced in this time is very taboo and somewhat looked down upon socially. So, but what a lot of people don't know, and the way that Arthur presents himself, is that he was very sensitive to scandal. He didn't like bad press out about him. He didn't like to see his name in the news in any negative light. And his wife Carrie knew this, and this is why she went to Edwin very early on when she found out about this in hopes that Edwin would nip it in the bud before things escalated to this point in time. Um, and many people within high society who were in their social circles and other social circles were pretty much entranced by this scandal, especially as the rumors were percolating um, in friendship groups. There were your casual talks at different parties and events about, oh, have you heard about the Pennells and the Burdicks and what's going on in their twisted love triangle? So it's after the divorce papers are filed that some real juicy rumors start to surface. And that's how we get our rumor mill going. So I talked about the Paynes earlier, and specifically Gertrude Payne was quite the social butterfly after divorcing her rich husband, who had cheated on her. Um, Gertrude was a nosy Nancy to a lot of people, but she was a key player if you were looking for gossip for the quote unquote people of high society here in Western New York. Um, Edwin actually would use her as a source of news to see if the Pennells were going to be attending events that he planned on going to, charitable events, community events, different things with the golf club. And if they were going, Edwin would decide not to go just to avoid confrontation, to avoid the awkward stares and looks of people pointing. But on his part, though, um, rumors also started to surface that Edwin was consorting with other society women, including Mrs. Warren of Cleveland Avenue, a few blocks down from the Pennells, and of Mrs. Payne of Elmwood Avenue, talking about Gertrude. Um, Now, these were never corroborated stories. These were just part of the rumor mill, if you will. But it also came out that Alice and Arthur had taken trips to Niagara Falls in the Pennell's electric carriage and had trysted the night away in the Waldorf Astoria while Alice was away in New York. So you can see that some of these stories would start to get quite elaborate in the detail of this affair that was taking on between two of the village's high society couples. Um, the Elmwood Dance Club, though, where Edwin was president, starts to become another place of rumor. And people start to mention the Elmwood Dance Club as a place where young to middle-aged bon vivants would gather for dissolute purposes, aka fishbowl parties. Drop your keys. Whatever lady gets your keys, gentlemen, that's your partner for the evening. And we're talking dancing. So, February 27th, 1903, we're about a week or so away from the Burdick's divorce proceedings being finalized. Um, Pardon me. So it's on the morning of February 27th, 1903, that Edwin is found lying on his sofa in his den with his head bashed in. Um, there's several oddities about the circumstances of the murder that were never resolved, and we're going to get into them in the next few slides. And although most reports say that Edwin was beaten with one of his own golf clubs, um, there was never any blood found on any of his golf clubs that were stored in the den, and none of his clubs were missing from the set of clubs. Um, However, one detail that had great significance was the fact that a plate of cheese and crackers and a cocktail shaker were found on the table in the den with a couple of glasses. Some associates of Edwin said that this snack was an anthem, and I don't know, was too plebeian for Edwin. And also, the funny thing was the cocktail shaker was still found full of whatever cocktail was made up the night before Edwin was murdered. So the night before, Edwin had come home from work. He came home with a bottle of liquor, which was not really normal for Edwin, as he had some health complications that made him less likely to drink. Um, People in the house were aware of the bottle of liquor during dinner. Edwin, Mrs. Hall, and the three girls were present for dinner, none of which saw him drink during dinner. And after dinner and dessert, and the girls getting ready for bed, Edwin retired into the den where he would read books and smoke his pipe and occasionally have a cocktail or two, and like I say, on a rare occasion. Um, his cook Maggie, though, after serving dinner and dessert and cleaning up the kitchen, goes out to meet a few friends. That evening, he comes back to the residence around 10:18 and notices that Edwin was in his underwear. Um, at this time, the furnaces were powered by coal, so many believe that he disrobed from his evening wear to stock the furnace with coal, and then so he didn't get soot and stuff on that, and then go lay in clean bed sheets. So Maggie recollects seeing him around this 10:30 to 11 and hearing him go up and down the stairs to fill the furnace with coal. Now, as Maggie goes to her quarters, she does not recall hearing any additional voices with Edwin on the night of his murder after arriving home and before falling asleep. This was common as the Burdicks did not usually entertain guests on weeknights. Mostly those were saved for weekend occasions or holidays where they would have guests over in that sort of on those types of evenings. So going back to the morning of the 27th, Maggie wakes up, and as she does, she went to go wake up Mr. Burdick to let him know that coffee was ready and that she was in the process of starting breakfast. But Edwin was not in his room. When she notices him not in there, she remembers, oh yeah, the last place he was at was his den. So she walks down the hall and lets Mrs. Hall know that Edwin's nowhere to be found, and then Mrs. Hall went down to the den to check for Edmund. They open the door and they call out 3 times into the den, and Edwin does not answer. They're too afraid to go in there, as maybe Edwin had one of his health flare-ups. So Mrs. Hall asks Maggie to finish the breakfast in the kitchen, and then when she's done finishing breakfast for her and the children, to run over to the pharmacy to call the family physician, Dr. Marcy, to come check on Edwin. She asked this as she didn't want to scare the children in case it was just a flare-up with one of Edwin's ailments, as it has happened in the past where he'd be down and out for a couple of days. So after making dinner, going to the pharmacy to make the call to Dr. Marcy, Dr. Marcy arrived at the home first, and some things happened from there. They did not call the police, they called the doctor first. So in the den, when they opened the door, the room was still dark, as the Venetian blinds were drawn shut. And when they finally opened the Venetian blinds, Dr. Marcy notices Edwin on the couch, and his face is covered with pillows and blankets, and that there's blood all over the sofa. At this point in time, Dr. Marcy rushes over, checks his pulse, and realizes that Edwin has passed, and most likely he had been murdered. Mrs. Hall then notifies the children, who were still eating their breakfast at this point in time after Dr. Marcy's arrival, that their father had passed away last night. Most important meal of the day, but let me tell you some very other important news, that your father has passed. So after this happens, they contact the police. The police come to the residence. As the coroner and medical examiner arrives, Dr. Marcy makes this odd request that the coroner list the death as a suicide, which, Dr. Marcy's a medical doctor. The coroner hasn't even had a chance to do the autopsy to really see what the cause of death was. But after seeing the way the body was found, the coroner slash medical examiner has no doubt in their mind that there was foul play involved here with the death of Edwin Burdick. Um, the coroner rules that Edwin Burdick had died from blunt force trauma to the head. But there was nothing in the house as the police are going through it that can be identified as the murder weapon. Also, the coroner makes the medical assumption that Edwin was murdered around 2 o'clock in the morning on the 27th. So when the police show up, start taking a look at the scene, um, it does look like a robbery at first, due to the fact that there's a kitchen window that was open. The front door was slightly ajar when Maggie woke up that morning. There was the cheese and crackers with the bottle of liquor and the shaker. Um, and like I said, the police, after talking with the family and staff there, they find it odd that Edwin has this out, even though he really doesn't eat that food and drink due to his medical conditions. Um, and some believe there was another person who came to meet with Edwin at the house that night. The police believe that the crime scene was staged with the window open, the door being left ajar, because there was nothing of significant value actually stolen from the house. Um, and this was before profiling and things of that nature. But the medical coroner um, and reports at the time start to say that when you cover someone's face um, after doing bodily harm or killing them, especially depending how they pass away, if their eyes are open, um, they an assailant tends to cover someone's face so they don't have those eyes staring back at them, especially when the victim is known by the assailant. And that's why they believe Edwin's head was wrapped in a blanket under the pillows when first discovered. Um, but the police have the burning question of who would Edwin have trusted enough to let into his home that late at night, especially while not entertaining guests. We know that he had just purchased a revolver for self-protection, and and if you're purchasing something for self-protection, you're probably not going to let someone into your home that you don't have the utmost certainty is not going to do you bodily harm. So the coroner determines that Edwin was first struck in his back to somewhat subdue him, and then was bludgeoned in the head 20 times after being subdued by being hit in the back. Um, at this point in time in the investigation, police believed that it was a woman who was behind the slayings, as there were some talks of lovers, as we talked about a few slides earlier. But the coroner didn't believe that a woman um, came in, bludgeoned him 20 times, and then left with the object afterward. Brought it in, left with it. Now, this isn't me, this was the coroner, this is reports at the time. But a long strand of what was thought to be woman's hair was also found on Edwin's body. Um, this was never positively identified, even though several of Burdick's women friends and quote-unquote possible lovers were interviewed. No one really had the hair color that matched the strand of hair that was found on Edwin's body. So it's also during this time that police were also intrigued by Dr. Marcy's interference in the investigation, especially the early steps of it, by trying to stop the police from asking questions to Mrs. Hall and the Burdick children. Um, Usually, it's standard procedure during an investigation to question the people who are in the home, especially as they were there sleeping, quote unquote, during the time that Edwin was murdered. Um, Also during this time, Edwin's business partner comes over, and Dr. Marcy lets the business partner know that he was the guardian of the children and that his business partner needed to protect the children, and the partner should have an attorney present. And this also confused police as Mrs. Hall and the three girls were not under suspicion for committing the murder. Um, Police at this point in time, after getting input from Mrs. Hall and possibly hearing around town what was going on between the Pennells and Burdick, that Arthur was behind this murder. especially after talking with people who were in the office that day. The comments made to Edmund by Arthur about killing him, Alice, and himself, if he divorced Alice, were really the biggest amount of evidence that they potentially had to name Arthur as their main suspect in the murder. There is also some speculation that since Arthur was still seeing Alice and that they had gone to Niagara Falls and were trysting away in the Waldorf Astoria, that Alice may have given Arthur a key to the house to dispose of their problem of Edmund while Arthur had visited her in New York City during the month of January. So we talked about how Arthur on the outside didn't look like it, but internally was very reserved. And he was very proud of his name and what he had built for himself as a lawyer. So, in being in the public eye, he did not want the contents of the letters between Alice and himself to be made public in court during these divorce proceedings. These details within the letters themselves would have ruined his reputation, brought shame to his family, potentially hurt his practice, um, and things of that nature, especially being heralded pillar of the community. But how can you trust someone who's gonna sleep around with his best friend's wife? Yeah, that's not someone that I would potentially trust if it was me. But Arthur, after Edmund's death, is heard pleading his case around town that he didn't commit the murder, that even though he was sleeping with Alice, that Evan was his best friend and that he was the godfather of his children. Um, Arthur's barber would go and make a statement to police that Edmund would never, or Arthur would never do such a thing, that he is a lawyer and he upholds the rule of law. But one funny thing that Arthur did say during this time was that he believed that he loved Alice more than she loved him, and that most likely she would not have stayed with Arthur if he was to have divorced his wife. Um, but associates at that time notice as um, from the 27th of February on that Arthur starts to become more withdrawn from people, um, as he thought that people believed that he committed the murder of Edward Burdick. As he's going out around town, people are whispering, pointing, and looking in his direction, and he really starts to believe that everyone thinks that he's responsible for this heinous crime. Um, so as the time goes on, he gets these stronger and stronger paranoid thoughts, and some people close to Arthur at this time believe that he has grown stronger and stronger thoughts of suicide, due to this this death looming over him, the the news about the affair and scandal um, being talked about all around town, especially with the friends or people who believed to be his friends who were in the same social circles as him and Edmund. So on March 10th, 1903, perfect. Um, after thinking the police were going to come after him for the murders, Arthur and Carrie Pennell are involved in a horrific auto accident. Um, while driving in their electric carriage, it is rumored that Arthur lost his hat and, in an attempt to grab it, veered off the road in the Gares Stone Quarry, off Kensington near Fillmore Avenue. Um, the car swerved off the road, um, landed about 60 feet below. Um, Arthur, after authorities arrived, a medical personnel arrived, a medical emergency personnel arrived. It's deemed that Arthur died in the crash itself on site. Carrie, however, was very injured, but was still alive. She was taken to the hospital and unfortunately dies the next day on March 11th due to the injuries she sustained in the accident. With the death of Arthur, um, while the investigation into Edwin's death was going on, the presiding judge who was issuing warrants over the investigation, Judge Murphy, had to adjourn the case with no verdict, as Arthur was was the only and the main suspect. Um, so many believe that Arthur purposely wrecked the carriage in order to escape the reality he was facing in terms of his marriage and the affair, the murder accusations of his best friend, and his relationship with Alice was also somewhat deteriorating due to all these things coming out. And it does say that in this newspaper clipping from the time that new tragedy and verdict mystery, attorney whose name has been linked with case plunges over cliff to death in auto with wife. And yeah, it's just terrible. So it's after the death of Edwin that Alice does come back into town. And her and Mrs. Hull live out the rest of their lives out of the public eye. No one ever finds out if Alice had anything to do with her husband's death. Unfortunately, so the case goes cold and it's closed after the death of Arthur Pennell. Edwin was returned to his hometown in Canastota, New York, and he was buried in Mount Pleasant Cemetery. Arthur and Carrie Pennell's bodies were returned to Brunswick, Maine, and they were buried in Pine Grove Cemetery. Now, like I said, Alice remained in their home at 101 Ashland until she passed away in 1944, and she is buried in Forest Lawn at a family plot. The Burdick children, Mary and Carol and Alice, did move away for some time. They all did marry and have families of their own, but they are also buried at the family's plot in Forest Lawn Cemetery. So next time you're cruising through, you can go visit them and say hello. And oh, hold on, let me go back. And this is the home in that earlier picture, 101 Ashland. This is what the home looks like today, blue or purple with white trim and some pretty large number of plants outside. But this is the home as you can see it today. So next time you're on the garden walk or over there for Porch Fest, you can go check out 101 Ashland, and you can ask if they knew someone was murdered in the house they live in. But Kitty, with that being said, I am ready for questions if there are any hands raised or in the chat.
Okay, great story, Ryan. Thank you. I used to live on Ashland Ave. I feel I was the neighbor to that house. Interesting. We do have a question in the chat. And it said, what is Mrs. Hall's first name?
Maria.
What is Maria? Okay. And what is the relationship of her to the Hall family living in Lancaster on Genesee and Pavement?
I do not know. I did not. This is the first time I've been asked about the Halls. So I'm going to answer this the best way I know and say I don't know if they're related. I know they were from out of town, and I know that Mrs. Hall did move from their home in Canastota, their home in Canastota where Edwin and Alice met, to Buffalo at that time. So, and I know that all the Burdick girls did marry, so I don't know if there is a relation between Mrs. Hall and our story and the Halls in Lancaster on Pavement. But you can ask them.
That would be an interesting question. Okay, another question here. in the chat. Was any evidence saved and tested at a later date? And is this still an open case?
So I have not read anything of recent testing with DNA evidence, if that's what you're asking for, DNA, fingerprints, things of that nature. I know that it was never quote unquote solved, but Judge Murphy did adjourn and close the case due to lack of evidence for potential other suspects. So you could say it's a closed case, but it was never quote unquote solved.
All right, and then just a comment that the houses in that area are so beautiful to this day.
Oh, yes, they are.
Yes, it's kind of some nice streets to walk down and maybe go up to Elmwood and have a cup of coffee, and because the houses are beautiful and the gardens and the flowers, everything. All right, I don't see anyone with a hand raised. If someone wants to ask a verbal question, I could unmute you. And that's where you'd use that little hand icon at the bottom of the page. Looks like that. Just run through there. Okay. Looks good, Ryan.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for being on today and joining us. And we have another scandal coming out this spring, so check your local listings to see when it may be at a University Express site near you.
Yes, everyone, we are looking forward to the spring, summer semester. Our catalog will be out mid-April to early May, and we will be promoting the classes as well. Have a great day today. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
See you at trivia, guys.
Oh, we did have one last question. Was the doctor not investigated?
No, he was not.
The doctor was not
He
investigated.
was weird, but he was never looked at as a potential suspect.
And yes, this will be available on the University Express website under, we've recorded it, so it will be available to view at a later date. Okay. Have a good day, everyone.
Take care, guys.